worrisome. We have the chief economist with us, our PricewaterhouseCoopers, Andrew Nevin, is in the studio live to look at this. Thank you very much, Andrew, and compliments of the season.
Well, Happy New Year. Totally fantastic to be here.
Yeah, let's start with this issue, the tension rising, looking at Iran and the United States. Many say this will lead to fluctuations in oil price and currency issues. I don't know if you agree to that.
Well, I think we're now in uncharted territory. I don't think anyone, and certainly not myself, can make predictions on where this is going, but we've entered a dangerous phase. If you follow the news over the 24 hours, this keeps escalating and escalating. The Iranians are very clear that they're going to retaliate in some way. So I think we should expect turmoil. Whether or not we lead to an all-out war between Iran and the USA is anyone's guess at this point, but it is not good for world stability.
I was reading today, and oil prices soared as much as 4% on Friday, and analysts are saying this might continue if the situation is not looked at.
Well, we'll say what we've always said in these situations. When oil price is high, then Nigeria should take advantage of it and increase its excess crude account and invest this money wisely, because it's likely not to last. We all know the long-term trajectory for oil, or even the medium-term trajectory, is oil is going to be used less and less. So I don't think Nigeria will be an oil economy in 20 years or 30 years. We need to prepare for it. So if oil prices blip up because of geopolitical events, or maybe $100, $150 if there's closing down the strait, then we need to take advantage of that to build our infrastructure and not waste that money.
But some are saying this is not coming at a very good time. Now that China and already United States were trying to put pen to paper to resolve some of these issues, and now this is popping up with Iran. Some are saying this could, affect us globally, generally.
Well, I think the expectation should be that the economy outside of Africa cannot help Africa. I mean, the truth is, just from a demographic viewpoint, the number of economically active people in the world is basically flat or declining. You might have this illusion that the population is growing, but country after country, the youth and the actively employed population is actually starting to shrink. And overall, outside of Africa, it's flat. So there can't be much economic growth, because productivity may increase 1%. That's going to be the limit on that. And in fact, people always lament Japan's performance, but the truth is that Japan's income per capita, GDP per capita, has continued to grow. Income per working person. What's happened is the number of working people has declined. But all this adds up to saying growth outside of Africa is not there. It's not going to help Africa. We had this concept in 2017 of globally synchronized growth. It went away. 2018 slowed down, 2019 more. And even without these geopolitical issues, I think you should expect slower growth, and only Africans can build an economy for Africa. So the outside Africa events are only going to be a negative for us. Now, if we have a small blip in oil or a big blip in oil for a short time, we take advantage of that, but we cannot expect anyone outside of Africa to help our economy.
So Africa must grow Africa.
Yes.
That's what you're talking about now. Now let's tilt now towards what people have been talking about. It's 2020. It's that year where there is no election, there is no nomination of cabinet members. Everything is working on already as planned. We have the monetary side been doing all they've been able to do. Now we see projections from the World Bank. Just even we talked about one earlier, talking about Nigeria growing at 2.3, 2.4%, and some are saying that's a step in the right direction. I don't know how that comes to you.
Well, we've said consistently that we need to grow 6 to 8%, and I mean, I don't think we can celebrate going from 2% to 2.3%. 2.3% is still the country getting poorer and poorer per capita. So it's just not good enough. But I think some things have changed. I mean, first off, I think everyone clearly understands, and the federal government is committed to lift 100 million people out of poverty over the next decade. So then you can ask, what is the government doing to lift people out of poverty? Two, I do think that people recognize, the government and people recognize, ease of doing business, enabling environment, all of those things. Then we've made some progress with PEBEC, and Dr. Jamoke has been, but we have a lot more to go, but at least people know that it's absolutely critical. I think the third thing that's really going to start to help Nigeria is a lot more transparency. Obviously, the president came out and he said we're going to be more transparent, large transactions will be transparent. But you also have NGOs like Budge IT coming out and showcasing projects that are not getting done, or showcasing ones that are getting done. So even though we haven't broken out of the low growth trap, you can see these forces at work that are trying to make us do that. So I think that there's a lot of work to do, but we're in a much better place than we were 2 years ago.
We're in a better place than where we were like 2 years ago. That means something is being done right. And I'll take you back to the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, which is something that we talked about at a particular time, and many talked about proper implementation. Yes, now we know that the budget cycle is back to January, December, and this document remains on the ground. How well do you see all of this playing out? Are we moving at the pace at which we're supposed to move as a country?
Well, I think we said 3 years ago, and we'll repeat it now, that while any individual part of the Economic Recovery and Growth Plan may make sense, the problem with it was too complex, too many programs, too many interventions. And coming from a business environment, if you came to Nigeria to build, or you were Nigerian, you wanted to build a business, if you wanted to build a national business, you would recognize it would take you 15 to 20 years. So business people, when they hear the government say we're going to build a national program in the space of an election cycle, realize it can't happen. So there were so many programs, so many initiatives in the ERGP that the business people knew they could not be implemented. And that's in fact what's happened. So I think we continue to say that the federal government should be thinking about simplification, fewer MDAs. I mean, there was the report, I think, in 2013 about simplification, putting some duties together, making the country easier to manage, devolving powers to the extent allowed by the Constitution down to the state level. We're very big on subnational development. In some cases, maybe even having a constitutional discussion and see if there's some movement there. But development's only going to really happen at the state level, the individual level. A country of over 200 million people cannot have Abuja set up programs that are going to impact all Nigerians.
So it should be a statewide thing, local government thing, or what do you expect? You talked about Abuja now, and that's really very important.
Well, I think that, I mean, we have said this for a while at PwC, but I think others are also starting to say it. The World Bank is saying it, people within the country say it, that, I mean, why, the people who are optimists like myself, why are we optimistic about Nigeria? Because Nigerians are so capable. There's so much energy in Nigeria to get things done. So sometimes when the federal government fights that energy. So I think what we're saying is let's use that energy. But the energy is at the local level, it's at the state level. But this subnational development really, I think, gained momentum in 2019. And we see some governors doing incredible things. I mean, obviously Governor Samuel Olu here is doing incredible things. Deputy Governor Dr. Hamzat. I mean, I was at the big event, the technology event they had just before we broke for the new year. The announcements they made were fantastic, the smart city, but also you see them implementing it. I mean, they're really trying, and of course over 20 years since 1999, or more than 20 years now, Lagos has made great progress. But I was with an official last night, a Lagos official who I won't name, very senior official, but was making the point that Lagos is doing well, but it's a problem because when Lagos does well, it attracts more people from the rest of the country, right? So it's not sufficient for Lagos to do well. We need every state to do well. And of course, we see, I mean, just to name a few governors that are certainly trying hard. I'm not leaving out any other governors there are, but Governor Makinda, I think, in Oyo State is making real states. Governor El Rufai in Kaduna is really making strides in that area. So we would like to see more acknowledgement from the center of the need to have things happen at the state level. And then what are the implications of that? If it's going to happen at the state level, what does that mean for the way that we have governance in this country?
I'm going to have to touch on this very importantly. We always talk about power and what power means for businesses. Looking at what NERC is coming out with, saying there is an increase, coming out to say there is no increase, there is a review. What's your take about what's happening with NERC and the power sector in general?
Well, I think it's a little bit like this issue with the 100 million people out of poverty. There's now a recognition that the power sector is not functioning. So at least there's a debate about what the movement forward is. Now, we at PwC have put forward the idea we would like to see industrial users pay a lot more, but get uninterruptible power because they create jobs, and to the extent there's power beyond what they're using, we can sell it to consumers and bottom of the pyramid consumers at a lower cost. That's the structure so it's obviously NERC is starting to debate this. They recognize what we have is not sustainable. We need some sort of cost reflective tariffs, but also for industry, to industrialize, you need uninterruptible power. And so with the announcement yesterday, today, the confusion, from the DG of NERC on that, trying to dispel, at least there's some movement that something has to give. We can't, the amount that the CBN has put in its intervention programs is larger than the total amount the federal government received in the privatization in 2013. So at least the recognition is there. So maybe I'm optimistic at interruptible power because they create jobs, and to the extent there's power beyond what they're using, we can sell it to consumers and bottom of the pyramid consumers at a lower cost. That's the structure so it's obviously NERC is starting to debate this. They recognize what we have is not sustainable. We need some sort of cost reflective tariffs, but also for industry, to industrialize, you need uninterruptible power. And so with the announcement yesterday, today, the confusion, from the DG of NERC on that, trying to dispel, at least there's some movement that something has to give. We can't, the amount that the CBN has put in its intervention programs is larger than the total amount the federal government received in the privatization in 2013. So at least the recognition is there. So maybe I'm optimistic, and we're optimistic 2020 there'll be some big movement in the power sector. Yeah, of course, and every day people are coming up making the most obvious point: if we don't have power, we're not going to industrialize, we're not going to create employment. And of course, at the same time, we have the most fantastic gas reserves in Nigeria, so we have a low-cost source of producing basically an infinite amount of power.
Really worrisome, because that power sector, for a country of more than 200 million people, we're not even doing 5,000 megawatts. Transmission comes with their issue, distribution comes with their issues, generation comes with their issues, and everybody have different issues. Let's move on. Another thing I'd like us to touch on is inflation and border closure. This is working side by side, and I think it's really important we touch on that. Government says the border remains closed until neighboring countries are ready to meet up with requirements of bringing goods and services into the country. Now, some are saying this has its positives and its negatives. I don't know what you think, and how long do you think Nigeria can sustain this?
Well, I was at an event with a senior government official who made the point that actually the primary reason for the border closures was security, and made the point that is health security. So I think security trumps economics in that sense, and if that's the case, then it was necessary. But I think the other point is that it was obvious to everyone involved that the way the Cotonou port was working was not in accordance with the ECOWAS rules, right? So, when we say free movement of goods and people in the ECOWAS region, the goods that we're talking about are goods that are produced in ECOWAS. You can't take goods in through Cotonou and then transship them to Nigeria and claim duty-free status. And effectively, that was what was happening. So in that sense, the federal government was in a position where it had to do something. Maybe they waited too long, maybe there was another way, but that was the decision they took. But there had to be action on that. Now, in terms of how that relates to, and obviously some legitimate businessmen women got caught up in that, and that's very, very sad. But there was no option but to make a decision. Now, in terms of inflation, I think the point that we've always made is, one, to be honest, in the last year's inflation numbers we don't really understand, because if you look at the monthly inflation, it's basically 1% a month plus or minus a very small amount for the last 8 or 9 months. Statistically, that's not really possible. Inflation should have, if you look at other countries, has more variation than the National Bureau of Statistics is coming out with. So we're wondering exactly how are these numbers put together. But more importantly, inflation, the headline inflation number we think is not really important to an individual. What's important to an individual is their own inflation rate. And particularly, I think we have more than 50 or 60% of Nigerians who spend more than 50% of their income on food. So the question is, what's the price of food? And this is where I think the NBS, they do such a fantastic job producing their food price survey in localized areas. That's what they should be putting forward, rather than 11.9, 11.8, 11.7. I'm not sure that helps the debate. The real issue, and particularly now with the border closures, what is the price of rice and tomatoes in Benin City, what is it in Sokoto, what is it in Jigawa? And that's what the government needs to watch, because that's what really affects the welfare of the majority of Nigerians. So the NBS does such a great job producing that report, and yet they only put out really the headline number is the one that we talk about. I'd like us to stop talking about the headline number and start talking about what's happening in individual parts of the country with food prices.
Let's almost round this up now with issues around budget. We see Nigeria returning to the January-December budget cycle, and many say this will help build investors' confidence. One, make projects, contractors get to work at good times, funds will be released in time, and we could get better. And it's 2-in-1. What's your assessment of the infrastructure development going on all across board? We can see what's happening.
Well, I think that no, absolutely, and I mean I think this government has had a commitment to infrastructure development. I think the fact that the budget cycle has come in the calendar year is a great achievement, much better. And to your point about releasing funds, I mean the federal government, it causes problems in the economy when projects are started but they can't release the funds. If you don't have the funds, don't start the project, and then if someone does the work, they need to be paid in a timely fashion. So you had your piece about the pension arrears. I mean, that's an obligation of the government. If you can't pay your obligations, you're effectively insolvent, right? So, the government needs to pay its obligations. So I think that's a positive. And some of these really big headline projects like Niger Second Bridge, Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, critical projects, and it's great the government's driving them. But we need to remember that we have an infrastructure deficit in Nigeria of about $100 billion a year. So the amount that the federal government can do is actually tiny. And what the federal government should be doing is focusing all of its resources available for infrastructure or capital projects to the few things it can do. But I'll give you an example. Something like airports, the private sector will pay for airports. So you look at the airport in a new airport terminal in Lagos, it hasn't opened. There have been reports of some errors that have to be rectified. The federal government should not be using its resources for that. It should be building roads, it should be building bridges, it should not be building the Enugu airport, it should not have been building the Abuja airport. So given how small the amount of money the federal government has for infrastructure, focus it on the absolutely critical things that will unlock other investors to come into other sectors. And an obvious example is Ajaokuta Steel. We've heard the reports it's going to be, federal government's been paying for it with its very scarce resources, so we don't have enough education, we don't have enough health care. We've been keeping a steel mill alive that produces no steel. Now we've invited the Russians to participate, and again it seems like the federal government will make a contribution. Why not take that money and invest in the three things that really can make a difference: infrastructure, health care, and education? That's what's going to affect Nigerians.
Wow, on a final note now, let's look at some quick wins as we move on in the year 2020. Many say that, well, it's good on the monetary side. We talked about this off camera, talking about all that the central bank has been doing, interventions in the agriculture, textile, all of these interventions. In what way should the fiscal side come in? Just like we said, it's not an election year. We have political appointees, we have ministers, we have heads of agencies. So I think it's just time to get to work. What are the quick wins? What should be done quickly as we move on in 2020?
Well, I think the quick wins, is there a quick win? I mean, go back to what we discussed a bit earlier. The power issue is probably the number one issue in terms of unlocking the economy, right? So at least NERC is paying attention to it. There is going to be a tariff review. There's going to be some thinking about that. I think everyone recognizes we need some form of cost-reflective tariffs, particularly for industrial customers. So that would be the number one thing. And then in terms of the infrastructure, we've always been of the view that to the extent that the government has money, they should focus on road infrastructure, because it's actually quite inefficient to toll roads. So again, don't spend it on airports, spend it on roads, spend it on roads. And a road being tolled is inefficient. So that's something the government should do. So keep focused on those two things, get the second Niger bridge built, and then crowd in private investment to grow the economy.
Always private investment. Indeed, government cannot do all of it without private investment. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist, PricewaterhouseCoopers, thank you very much for spending your Monday afternoon with us on Business Nigeria.
Thank you.